The air hung thick, a suffocating blanket woven from humidity and the metallic tang of drying blood, underscored by the cloying sweetness of decay. Okinawa, April 1945. Sergeant Michael Harrison, his face a canvas of sweat and grime, moved with the practiced stealth of a predator, leading his diminished unit through the tangled maw of dense jungle. Every rustle of vegetation, every distant thrum of naval artillery, sharpened his senses, an insistent reminder of the precarious dance between life and oblivion. He stooped, his gaze snagging on a ripped Japanese uniform discarded in the mud, a dark, hardened stain marking where life had abruptly ceased. Nearby, a porcelain doll's eye gleamed wetly, smashed and forgotten, a miniature tragedy amidst the colossal one. This theater of war, brutal and unforgiving, had instilled in Harrison a grim understanding. For the Japanese, surrender was a stain on honor. But as he pressed on, a chilling paradox began to form in the periphery of his mind, a whisper of a possibility he couldn't yet grasp. For a group of women, imprisoned in an unimaginable hell, the arrival of the enemy American might not herald defeat, but instead, the desperate, unthinkable promise of salvation. The line separating captor from rescuer, already a blur in the fog of war, was about to vanish entirely. What would one do, he mused, when the only hope of freedom sprang from the very hands you were taught to abhor? It was a question that would soon demand an answer, not in theory, but in stark, immediate reality. Days, perhaps weeks before Harrison's boots scuffed the Okinawan earth, a different kind of authority had reigned. Lieutenant Tanaka, a man whose identity was etched into the brutal efficiency of his command rather than his face, moved like a shadow through the hastily constructed compound. He embodied the unyielding doctrine of Bushido, a creed that glorified sacrifice and absolute obedience to the emperor. For Tanaka, the women under his charge were not individuals. They were a fungible resource, tools to maintain the morale of his soldiers, a necessary offering to the war machine. He saw no cruelty in their plight, only pragmatism. Their abandonment to the coming American storm was not an act of barbarity, but a strategic redeployment of resources, a cold calculation to preserve the fighting strength of the empire. Individual sacrifice, he would intone to his subordinates, his voice devoid of warmth, is the very pillar of imperial glory. The distant, growing drone of American B-29s had been the first omen, a persistent hum that grew louder, more frequent, a metallic heartbeat thrumming through the tropical air. Tension had crackled among the Japanese soldiers, their movements betraying a frantic haste in the withdrawal. The once proud banzai cries had grown hollow, their conviction eroded by the relentless advance. Then, an unsettling quiet had descended upon the compound, a sudden suffocating silence that swallowed the jungle's usual cacophony. It was a silence pregnant with despair, a void filled only by the women's escalating terror and the lingering stench of abandonment. Every passing minute stretched into an eternity for those left behind, a terrifying countdown to an unknown fate. The stench hit Harrison first, a nauseating cocktail of human waste, decay, and fear. He and his squad had been systematically sweeping the abandoned Japanese positions, methodically clearing bunkers and supply caches. This particular barrack, half buried and crudely camouflaged beneath a tangle of vines, had seemed different, an anomaly in the otherwise uniform pattern of military structures. There was an irregularity in its construction, a subtle curve where there should have been a sharp angle. Harrison had gestured, his men setting to work with crowbars and axes. The heavy wooden door, reinforced with rusted metal bands, groaned in protest before finally splintering inward. The air inside was stagnant, thick with the reek of neglect and something far more sinister. Harrison's flashlight beam cut through the oppressive gloom, painting grotesque shadows on the walls. The scene that unfolded made his stomach clench. Emaciated figures, draped in tattered remnants of traditional clothing, huddled on the earthen floor, their faces gaunt, eyes wide with a terror that transcended language. Yuki Tanaka, a spectral figure with matted hair and skin stretched taut over sharp bones, was among them. Her gaze, initially vacant, fixed on Harrison's face as he stepped into the light. Her eyes, sunken and shadowed, held an unfathomable depth of dread. She didn't scream, didn't cry out. She simply trembled, a silent, desperate tremor that racked her fragile frame, her arms tightening around herself as if to hold her shattered being together. Harrison froze, an involuntary shiver tracing its way down his spine. Years of combat, countless horrors witnessed on blood-soaked battlefields, had steeled him against most sights. But this was different. These weren't enemy combatants. They weren't civilians caught in crossfire, or even fleeing refugees. These were victims, stripped of everything, left for dead. The initial shock quickly curdled into a cold, hard knot of nausea and righteous anger. Behind him, he heard a muffled retch. PFC Miller, barely out of high school, stumbled backward, his hand clamping over his mouth, a choked whisper escaping his lips. "For God's sake, Sarge." 12. Harrison counted them, his mind reeling. 12 women, reduced to shadows, confined in that unsanitary, lightless space. A hard number, yet one that barely scratched the surface of the barbarity that had once defined this place. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that many more must have perished here, succumbing to starvation, disease, or simply the crushing weight of despair long before his unit had stumbled upon them. His flashlight beam swept across the rough-hewn wall, catching a crude inscription, almost indecipherable in the flickering light. He called for Kenji, a Nisei soldier attached to his company as an interpreter. Kenji leaned in, his face grim. "Koko wa jigoku, kami wa inai," he translated, his voice barely above a whisper. "This place is hell. There is no God." The words hung in the air, a stark, agonizing echo of their suffering. Harrison tried to offer help. A canteen of water extended slowly, his voice a low, soothing murmur despite the tremor in his own hand. But his gesture was met with abject terror. The women recoiled, scrambling backward into the darkest corners of the barrack, some even attempting to claw their way through the dirt walls. He realized with a sickening jolt that the barrier wasn't merely language, it was a chasm of trauma. They didn't see a rescuer. They saw another aggressor, another uniform, another man who would inflict pain. Yuki, her eyes still locked on his, seemed to retreat further into herself, her gaze a mirror of suspicion and profound, unyielding fear. The unit's medic, a laconic man named Doc Riley, moved quickly, his face a mask of professional detachment that barely concealed his horror. His preliminary report was chilling. Severe malnutrition, scurvy, extreme dehydration, generalized infections. If they don't receive specialized, continuous care, Sergeant, their mortality rate will be catastrophic. He noted the women's apparent youth, a stark contrast to their withered bodies. Most didn't look a day over 20, yet their faces were etched with the lines of a lifetime of suffering. Then came the crackle of Harrison's radio. Captain Hayes's voice, terse and unyielding, cut through the humid air. "Sergeant, evacuate all civilians and prisoners to Collection Point X. No deviations. Time is of the essence. Any Japanese POWs are to be processed strictly according to Field Manual 2710. Harrison felt the cold weight of impending insubordination settle heavily upon him. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that these women, these broken, victimized souls, could not be treated as mere prisoners of war. He tried to rally his squad, explaining the unique horror of the situation. Miller, still shaken, offered his own canteen of water, a small act of kindness in a world devoid of it. But Sergeant Johnson, a grizzled veteran whose eyes had seen too much, remained skeptical. "They're Japanese, Sarge," Johnson grumbled, his voice laced with the weary cynicism of war. "Could be spies, saboteurs, anything. Orders are orders." The women, particularly Yuki, continued to watch Harrison with an unnerving intensity, their distrust an almost palpable force. The struggle between duty and decency had begun. Harrison knew he needed more information, something to cut through the military's rigid protocols. He sought out Kenji Tanaka, the Nisei translator, whose presence had already proven invaluable. Kenji, a quiet man who carried the dual burden of his heritage and his uniform, listened intently as Harrison described the barracks' inhabitants. As Harrison spoke, Kenji's face tightened. He recognized the horror unfolding. The term, spoken softly by Kenji, sliced through the humid air like a cold blade. Comfort women. Harrison felt a wave of nausea, a primal disgust at the euphemism. These women weren't comforting anyone. They were enslaved, brutalized, discarded. Kenji explained that they were not prisoners of war in any conventional sense. They were forced sexual labor for the Japanese military. Kenji revealed more, drawing on intelligence reports filtering through from other newly captured territories. Sergeant, there have been similar discoveries at other posts. These comfort stations were systematic. Estimates suggest tens of thousands of women across the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere were subjected to this dehumanizing system. The scale of the atrocity transformed Harrison's isolated incident into a chilling piece of a vast, barbaric puzzle. His problem was no longer just 12 starving women. It was a testament to systematic dehumanization on an unimaginable scale. During a more thorough sweep of the barrack, a small leather-bound notebook was discovered, tucked away beneath a loose floorboard. It belonged to one of the women who had not survived. Her name, now only a faded memory, lost to the horrors of the place. The pages were filled with elegant if faint Japanese script, small, hurried drawings, and a chilling series of dates, each entry a silent testament to the frequency and brutality of the services she had been forced to render. It was a tangible piece of evidence, irrefutable proof of their enslavement, a scream etched onto paper. Harrison, armed with this grim evidence, confronted Captain Hayes again, his voice tight with a newfound urgency. He demanded a different treatment for the women, a recognition of their unique status as victims, not enemy combatants. Hayes, his face a mask of irritation, dismissed Harrison's pleas. Sergeant, we have a war to win. Logistics are paramount. Our priority is to advance, not to cater to exotic civilian prisoners. Harrison felt a cold dread. He knew the risk he was taking, the insubordination, the potential for court-martial. But the image of Yuki's hollow eyes, now slowly, tentatively, beginning to register the vehemence of his arguments, burned in his mind. He couldn't back down. He had to fight for them. He had to honor that faint, nascent spark in Yuki's gaze, a spark that hinted at something other than utter despair. The order was delivered with the swift, impersonal efficiency of military bureaucracy. Transfer the women to the newly established Japanese civilian internment camp. Harrison's stomach churned. He'd heard whispers about the conditions there, vague, unsettling reports from a sergeant who had passed through days earlier. Overcrowding, he'd said, minimal rations, a complete absence of specialized medical support, and guards hardened by a war that had taught them to view all Japanese with suspicion. For Harrison, the camp was not a solution. It was a different kind of prison, a place where the women's profound trauma would be ignored, their physical and psychological recovery impossible. He realized then, with a chilling clarity, that to follow this order, to deliver these broken women into such a fate, would be to become complicit in their ongoing suffering. It was a moral revelation, a seismic shift in his understanding of his duty. His military honor, he understood in that moment, meant something far deeper than blind obedience. It meant protecting the most vulnerable, even if it meant defying the system he was sworn to uphold. The rules of engagement, the protocols of war, dissolved in the face of such profound human suffering. His conscience, not his orders, would now be his guide. Harrison sought out Kenji Tanaka once more, the weight of his decision heavy on his shoulders. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and the distant rhythmic thud of artillery fire. "Kenji," Harrison began, his voice low, "what are the legal and ethical implications here? We can't send them to that camp." Kenji, leaning against a weathered supply crate, sighed, running a hand over his tired face. "Sergeant, under the Geneva Conventions, they are technically civilians in occupied territory, but their circumstances, they exist in a gray zone. The military bureaucracy has no precedent for this kind of situation. They'll just be lumped in with everyone else." He paused, looking out at the jungle. "The real dilemma, Sergeant, isn't legal. It's psychological. How do you restore dignity to women who've been systematically stripped of it? How do you heal trauma so profound it redefines their very existence? What happens to a soul after such dehumanization?" Doc Riley's words echoed in Harrison's mind, spoken just hours earlier. "The risk of suicide and complete psychological collapse is astronomical. if there's no immediate specialized intervention. Harrison looked back at Kenji. And the outcome? What's their chance if we follow orders? Kenji shook his head grimly. Minimal, Sergeant. At best. An internment camp won't address their specific needs. The extreme trauma, the profound malnutrition, the mental health crises. They'll just fade. Doc Riley's prognosis returned with chilling specificity. 50% of them probably won't last another month, and those who do survive will never lead a normal life. The statistical outcome was a death sentence. Harrison felt the burden of that knowledge, the crushing weight of their suffering, and the ethical abyss opening before him. His own unit's morale, the respect of his men, even his own moral compass, hung precariously in the balance. This wasn't just about saving lives, it was about upholding a fundamental human decency in the face of absolute depravity. The stakes were impossibly high, personal, and universal. The confrontation with Captain Hayes took place in the stifling confines of the command tent, the air thick with the smell of canvas and stale coffee. Hayes sat hunched over a map, his brow furrowed, a half-empty mug beside him. Harrison stood ramrod straight, his posture betraying none of the turmoil raging within him. "Captain," Harrison began, his voice steady despite the frantic pounding in his chest. "I cannot, in good conscience, transfer those women to the internment camp." Hayes looked up, his eyes narrowing. "Sergeant, we've been over this. Orders are orders. We don't have the resources for special cases." His voice was laced with the weariness of command, the frustration of a man burdened by countless immediate decisions. "With all due respect, sir," Harrison countered, his voice gaining strength. "This isn't a special case. This is a moral imperative. They weren't soldiers, Captain. They were slaves. They were subjected to unspeakable atrocities by their own military. Sending them to that camp would be a second imprisonment, a death sentence by neglect." He laid out the evidence, the medical reports, the scraps of writing, Kenji's intelligence, painting a picture of unimaginable suffering. He spoke of the dehumanization, the systematic nature of their abuse, arguing that the military's protocols, designed for combatants, simply did not apply here. He emphasized the severe risk of suicide, the deep psychological wounds that required specialized care, not the generalized indifference of an overcrowded internment facility. Hayes bristled, slamming his hand on the table. "You're questioning my orders, Sergeant? My authority? We're fighting a war, Harrison. There's no room for sentimentality, no time for elaborate humanitarian efforts." His face was flushed, his voice rising. "What do you propose, then? That we build them a 5-star resort? Do you want a court-martial for insubordination, Sergeant?" The threat hung heavy in the air, a palpable weight. Harrison met his gaze, unflinching. "No, Captain. I propose we uphold the very values we claim to be fighting for. I propose we do what is right. I will not transfer them to that camp." He paused, taking a breath, his resolve hardening into an unyielding conviction. "I will take them to a place where they can have a real chance to survive and recover." His final words were delivered with a quiet intensity that cut through the tension, a promise of defiant action. "You will come with me," he implied, not to the women but to the abstract concept of justice, a declaration that he would drag the truth and the victims into the light, even if it meant sacrificing his own career. He could feel the rapid thump of his own heartbeat against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat of fear and defiance. The specter of court-martial loomed large, a dark shadow over his future, yet a deep, unshakable conviction rooted him to the spot. He was doing the right thing, the only thing. The moral weight of these women's suffering far outweighed any personal consequence. Yuki, peering from a distance, saw the intensity of Harrison's exchange with his superior. She didn't comprehend the English words, but the rigid postures, the heated gestures, the raw emotion etched on Harrison's face spoke a universal language. She saw his anger, his frustration, but also a fierce, unwavering determination. It wasn't hope that stirred within her, not yet, but a strange, unfamiliar quietude, a momentary absence of the crushing, perpetual fear. She watched this strange American, a man who, for reasons utterly beyond her comprehension, seemed willing to fight for them. Hayes glared at Harrison, his eyes alight with a mixture of fury and, perhaps, a grudging, unspoken respect. The sheer audacity of the sergeant was infuriating, But the unvarnished truth in his impassioned plea resonated, however faintly. Hayes was a pragmatist. He knew the potential public relations nightmare if word of these specific atrocities, coupled with the military's cold indifference, ever leaked out. It wasn't just about Harrison's insubordination. It was about protecting the image, and perhaps the soul, of the cause they fought for. He sighed, a sound of weary resignation. "All right, Sergeant," he conceded, his voice low. "Find your damn solution. But don't expect it to be official. Keep it off the books. And for God's sake, don't let it become a distraction." The implicit message was clear. Harrison had won, but at his own risk, and under the strict condition of maintaining plausible deniability for the command. It was a reluctant, almost resentful nod to a higher moral authority that Hayes himself could not openly acknowledge. Harrison moved quickly, arranging the clandestine transport. He secured an old, dilapidated supply truck, requisitioning additional medical supplies and extra rations under false pretenses. The journey to the small mission hospital, tucked away in a less affected rural area, was fraught with peril. Roads were still unsecured, sniper fire a constant threat, but Harrison pushed his men onward, their faces grim but resolved. The women wrapped in coarse military blankets huddled silently in the back, their emaciated bodies jostling with every bump and turn. Upon arrival, the scene at the mission hospital was one of controlled chaos. Nuns, their habits stained with dirt and sweat, moved with quiet efficiency, tending to a makeshift ward overflowing with wounded civilians. American medics, stretched thin, worked tirelessly. Harrison explained the situation to Sister Agnes, the elderly, unflappable head nun, whose eyes, though tired, held an infinite well of compassion. She simply nodded, her gaze sweeping over the gaunt figures, and immediately set her charges to work, preparing beds and warm broth. The recovery was slow, agonizingly so. Each calorie, each drop of clean water, each moment of peaceful rest was a victory against the relentless grip of starvation and disease. But gradually, painstakingly, the women began to mend. Color returned faintly to their cheeks. Their eyes, once hollow and devoid of light, began to glimmer with a fragile, nascent hope. Yuki, in particular, seemed to blossom. One afternoon, as Harrison made his routine check, she looked at him not with fear, but with a gaze that held a profound, silent gratitude. She managed a faint, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture that spoke volumes more than any words could. Harrison returned to his unit, facing the inevitable. He received an official reprimand, a harsh notation in his service record for disobeying direct orders and exceeding authority. It marred his military career, ensuring that his path to promotion would be effectively blocked. But he wasn't severely punished. Hayes, it seemed, had ensured the solution remained sufficiently unofficial. While some within the higher echelons viewed him with suspicion, his own squad, particularly Miller and Kenji, regarded him with a quiet, fierce loyalty. His reputation among certain military circles was indeed tarnished, but he had earned a respect that transcended rank and medals. The story of the women, though never officially acknowledged or integrated into formal military reports, began to ripple discreetly through the ranks, a whispered testament to a deeper, often ignored, moral code. It prompted some subtle shifts in the treatment of civilians in occupied zones, a quiet precursor to a broader, if still incomplete, understanding of war's collateral damage. Decades later, in the gentle quiet of a late afternoon, an elderly Michael Harrison sat on his porch swing, the warm sunlight dappling through the leaves of an ancient oak. The scars of war, both visible and invisible, had long since faded into the landscape of memory. The mail brought an unexpected envelope, bearing the insignia of an international human rights foundation. Inside, a letter detailed their painstaking research, unearthing his name in obscure, declassified documents related to wartime humanitarian efforts. Attached was a faded, sepia-toned photograph, a group of Japanese women, their faces still showing the lingering effects of hardship, but their eyes, unmistakably, held a glimmer of peace. Among them, Harrison recognized a woman with an undeniable strength in her gaze, her features aged but undeniably familiar. Yuki Tanaka. It was a belated tribute, a quiet validation of an act of courage he had long since relegated to the recesses of his past. His actions, small in the grand sweep of history, had it seemed sown seeds of enduring impact. The story of the comfort women, once suppressed and silenced, had slowly, agonizingly begun to gain voice in the modern world, a testament to the persistent struggle for justice and remembrance. And his own fight, his stubborn refusal to abandon those victims, was now recognized as a precursor, a small but vital step toward that larger global acknowledgement. The war may strive to strip away our humanity, but it is in the unexpected acts of compassion, in the quiet defiance of barbarity, that we discover the true essence of resistance and the enduring promise of a more just future. What stories of sacrifice and redemption amidst conflict still demand to be told, for us to truly learn from the past? May more forgotten truths come to light, and may compassion always find its way, even in the darkest corners of human history. If the echoes of this tale of moral courage and human dignity resonated with you, I invite you to join our community. Hit that subscribe button if you're not already part of it. Give this video a like to help us reach more people, and share your reflections in the comments below. Your support ensures these important stories continue to be heard.